The late afternoon sun was bleeding a bruised purple across the horizon of Oak Haven, a town so small the highway seemed to pass through it with its breath held. On the dusty edge of Route 9, where the asphalt melted into cracked dirt, stood an abandoned auto body shop that smelled of rust, old oil, and bad intentions. Inside, four heavy-duty metal chairs were bolted to the concrete floor, occupied by four men whose names were whispered with respect across 3 states. They were the lead officers of the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club, men with calloused hands, scarred knuckles, and leather vests heavy with patches earned through years of hard riding. But right now, Marcus, the club's president, wasn't feeling like a legend. Heavy steel chains were wrapped tightly around his chest and arms, binding him to the chair. Beside him, his vice president, a massive man they called Bear, along with their 2 senior row captains, were equally immobilized. Their bikes were parked just outside, engines cold, chrome catching the dying light. The silence in the garage was suffocating, broken only by the hum of cicadas outside and the faint sound of footsteps on loose gravel. Marcus gritted his teeth, testing the slack of the chain, but it didn't budge. He looked down at his boots, accepting that whatever was coming for them, they were completely defenseless. That was when the rusted side door creaked open just a few inches. A small pair of eyes peeked through the darkness. A young black boy, no older than 9 or 10, stepped quietly into the shadows of the shop. He wore oversized denim overalls patched at the knees and a faded red t-shirt, his shoes caked in dry mud. He froze when he saw 4 towering men covered in tattoos. But instead of running, his eyes drifted down to the heavy iron padlock securing Marcus's chest. Bear growled softly under his breath, trying not to startle the kid. "Get out of here, son. This ain't a place for playing." The boy took a slow, hesitant step forward. His voice was small, barely higher than a whisper, but it carried through the cavernous room with absolute calm. "Don't be scared, I'll help you," the black boy told the 4 chain bikers. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the kid's nerve. Here they were, 4 grown men built like brick walls, completely trapped, and a child half their size was telling them not to be afraid. "Kid, you don't understand," Marcus said softly, lowering his voice so as not to alarm him. "The men who put us in these chains aren't coming back to talk. You need to run home right now." The boy didn't run. Instead, he reached into his deep overall pocket and pulled out a heavy, rusted pair of bolt cutters that looked almost too heavy for his slender arms. He dragged them across the concrete floor, producing a screeching metallic scrape that made Marcus's jaw tighten. The boy walked straight up to Marcus, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze steady. "My mama told me that when somebody is trapped, you don't ask why until after you set them free," the boy said, placing the jaws of the cutter against the link of the chain. Marcus watched in disbelief as the boy threw his entire body weight onto the handles. The kid's knuckles turned white, his teeth clenched, and with a sharp, echoing snap, the first link snapped in 2. But just as the heavy chain slid off Marcus's shoulders, the boy's head snapped toward the small window facing the dirt driveway. Headlights swept across the dust-covered glass. The engine rumble of 2 heavy pickup trucks vibrated through the floorboards. The men who had set this trap were back. The boy grabbed Marcus by the leather sleeve, his small fingers digging into the worn hide, and pointed toward a hole in the rotting wooden wall at the back of the shop. "Go through the woods," the boy whispered urgently, his eyes wide. "They won't see you in the trees." "What about you, kid?" Bear demanded, struggling against his own bindings. "They know me," the boy replied quickly, stepping back into the shadows near the front counter. "They won't hurt me. Just go." Marcus didn't want to leave the boy, but he knew 4 unarmed, chained men were useless against armed attackers. He quickly helped unhook Bear and the others using the cutters the boy dropped. Within 30 seconds, the 4 bikers slipped out through the back wall, disappearing into the thick oak brush just as the heavy front doors of the garage were kicked open. From behind a dense thicket of pine, Marcus watched through the cracks. He saw 3 men step into the shop, local thugs who had been trying to squeeze the Iron Eagles out of their turf. They were furious to find the chairs empty, but then one of them grabbed the boy by his collar, lifting his feet off the ground. Marcus wanted to charge back in, but Bear held him by the shoulder, shaking his head. If we rush in without weapons, they kill all of us, including the kid. Through the window, Marcus saw the boy say something to the men, pointing toward the opposite direction of the woods, intentionally leading them away from where the bikers were hiding. One of the men shoved the boy down onto the dusty floor before all three ran back to their trucks to pursue a false trail. Marcus rushed back into the garage, but by the time he cleared the doorway, the boy was gone, vanished into the shadows of the Oakhaven backroads as if he were a ghost. The four riders retrieved their hidden spare keys, kicked their engines to life, and rode back to their main clubhouse in the city. But Marcus couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that young voice echoed in the dark. "Don't be scared. I'll help you." A kid who had every reason to run from four terrifying strangers had chosen to stand his ground instead. The next morning, Marcus called an emergency assembly at the Iron Eagle's headquarters. The hall was filled with leather jackets, the smell of stale coffee, and the rumble of idle chatter. Marcus walked up to the microphone, his voice cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. He told the room full of hardened riders what had happened in the abandoned shop. He told them about the child who had saved their lives without asking for a single thing in return. "We don't leave debt unpaid," Marcus yelled over the crowd. "And right now, there's a kid out there in Oakhaven who stood up for us when we were at our weakest. We're going back to find him." Word spread faster than wildfire through the biking community. It wasn't just the Iron Eagles anymore. Other clubs, former rivals, independent riders, weekend cruisers heard the story of the four chain bikers and the brave kid with the bolt cutters. Within 48 hours, what started as four men searching for a young boy turned into something the state had never seen before. Over 2,000 riders from across 5 states assembled on the interstate, their exhaust notes rolling across the countryside like distant thunder. 2,000 engines roaring with a single purpose: find the boy. When a massive convoy rolled into the tiny town of Oakhaven, the ground literally shook. Main Street came to a standstill. Shopkeepers stepped out onto the sidewalks, hands over their mouths, watching the endless sea of chrome, leather, and denim slow down near the center of town. Marcus led the pack, pulling his heavy cruiser up to the steps of the local diner where townspeople usually gathered. He cut his engine, lifted his visor, and stepped off his bike. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and dust. The local sheriff came out, his hand resting nervously on his belt, looking at 2,000 bikers parked bumper to bumper down the entire length of the county road. "Is there a problem here, son?" the sheriff asked, looking at Marcus. "No problem, Sheriff," Marcus said calmly, walking forward. "We're looking for a kid, about 9 or 10 years old. Wears patched overalls. He saved 4 of my men 2 nights ago at the old auto shop." The sheriff's expression shifted instantly. The tension in his shoulders dropped, replaced by a sudden, heavy shadow across his face. He lowered his hand from his belt and let out a long, weary sigh, looking at the ground before looking back up at Marcus. "You mean Elijah?" the sheriff whispered softly. "Elijah," Marcus repeated, feeling the name settle in his chest. "Where is he? We want to thank him." The sheriff looked out over the sea of 2,000 waiting riders, then pointed a trembling finger down a narrow, unpaved lane that led out toward the swampy marshlands on the edge of town. "He lives down at the end of Mill Creek Road with his grandmother. But you're a little late." Marcus felt a cold knife twist in his stomach. "What do you mean late?" 2 nights ago, after those men left the shop, somebody went down to that cabin," the sheriff said quietly. "Elijah didn't tell him where you went, so they took his bike, the only thing his late father ever gave him, and they trashed his grandmama's small porch. Elijah's been sitting on that front step ever since, refusing to leave, scared those men are going to come back and hurt his family." The quiet rage that swept through the 2,000 riders was palpable. The hum of whispered anger rippled back through the lines. Marcus didn't say another word. He remounted his bike, turned the ignition, and signaled the line. 2,000 engines fired up in unison, creating a wall of sound that shook the leaves off the oak trees lining Mill Creek Road. They rode slowly down the dirt lane, kicking up a massive cloud of dust that hung in the air like smoke. At the end of the road stood a small, weathered wooden cabin with a tin roof. The front porch railings were broken, and in the middle of the yard sat the twisted, smashed frame of a small blue bicycle, its front wheel bent completely in half. Sitting on the top step of the damaged porch was Elijah. He looked tiny against the backdrop of the old house, clutching an old wooden broom handle like a shield, trying his best to look brave. Beside him sat his elderly grandmother, her thin hand resting protectively on his shoulder, tears brimming in her eyes as she saw the massive wall of iron and leather approaching her home. Marcus brought his bike to a stop right in front of the gate. Behind him, 2,000 motorcycles cut their engines all at once, plunging the clearing into a profound, reverent silence. Marcus dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped just at the bottom of the steps, removed his leather gloves, and looked up at the young boy holding the wooden stick. "Hey, kid," Marcus said softly, a faint smile breaking through his worn face. "I told you we'd see each other again." Elijah's eyes went wide as he recognized the face from the dark auto shop. The broom handle slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the porch boards. You came back?" "We don't forget the people who hold the light for us when we're in the dark," Marcus replied, stepping up onto the porch and dropping down onto one knee, so he was at eye level with the child. "I heard somebody broke your bike." Elijah looked down at his shoes, his small shoulders slumping. "It was my dad's. He built it for me before he passed away. They smashed it because I wouldn't tell him where you ran." Marcus turned his head and looked at the crowd behind him. He raised a single hand into the air. From the back of a large support truck that had been trailing the motorcycle procession, two large, burly riders stepped out carrying a brand-new, custom-built mini motorcycle, painted in glossy midnight black with bright chrome handlebars and a hand-painted emblem on the gas tank that matched the Iron Eagle's crest. On the side, in clean gold lettering, were the words, "Little Eagle." The crowd of riders parted as the bike was carried forward and set gently in the grass beside the smashed frame. But Marcus wasn't done. He reached inside his leather vest and pulled out a small, heavy brass key, laying it in Elijah's tiny palm. "That's yours," Marcus said, closing the boy's fingers over the metal. But more importantly, Marcus stood up and turned around, facing the 2,000 men and women standing beside their machines. "I want you to look out there, Elijah." The boy stepped to the edge of the porch, looking in total awe at the endless sea of people stretching down the road as far as his eyes could see. "Every single person standing out there is here because of you," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the quiet breeze. "You stood up for us when you had every reason to be afraid. Now, I want to promise you something. As long as these engines roll, nobody is ever going to break your porch again. Nobody is ever going to scare your family again. You don't just have a town, kid. You've got 2,000 big brothers and sisters watching your back for the rest of your life." A roar of applause and the thunderous revving of 2,000 engines erupted through the valley, shaking the very air around the small wooden cabin. Elijah's grandmother pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, wiping away tears of joy as she held her grandson tight. For the first time in days, the fear vanished from the young boy's eyes, replaced by a radiant, wide smile that lit up the entire yard. Later that afternoon, the three men who had harassed the town and destroyed Elijah's property were quietly escorted out of Oakhaven by the local authorities, having realized that pushing around a defenseless child came with a cost far greater than they could ever pay. They knew that anywhere they went in the state, 2,000 pairs of eyes were going to be watching. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the small cabin, Marcus helped Elijah mount his new bike, guiding him as he coasted safely around the grassy yard, the sound of laughter replacing the echoes of fear that had hung over the house for so long. Sometimes, the world can feel cold, heavy, and full of unwreckable chains, making us believe that strength only belongs to the big, the loud, and the powerful. But real strength doesn't come from heavy muscle or roaring engines. It comes from the quiet courage of a simple heart willing to say, "Don't be scared," when everyone else is running away.